Welcome to Kolkata, Bernardine. This is your first visit here, and we are so glad that we could make this happen. You've come to India before a couple of times, but would you just tell us a little bit about how you feel being here in Kolkata for the first time?
Yeah, it's always exciting to be in India. I first came here in 2006 for the British Council, and I did some events in Delhi and Chennai. And then I was at the Jaipur Literature Festival 2 years ago, and so this is my third time in the city. I only arrived a couple of days ago. I haven't really seen much, but it's, you know, India is such a large country, and it is so heterogeneous and so alive. There's so much to see. I feel that I need to come to India for like 3 months to really understand it and see it. But I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
So I thought we'd start at the very beginning, always a good place to start. And you come from a very specific background which has influenced and informed all your work. You were born in 1959, and in working class Woolwich, you grew up in a family of 8 siblings in the middle. Your mother was white, British, with, I think, Irish and German heritage as well. And your father immigrated to England from Nigeria 10 years before you were born. So that background is very specific and something that has really influenced your writing and your work over the course of time. So if you would just tell us, give us a little glimpse about that upbringing and what has that done to you as a writer?
Yes, so I have a very multicultural background. My surname is Evaristo, which is actually a Portuguese name, and my father's father came from Brazil to Nigeria in West Africa in the probably, we don't know when exactly, but I imagine it was the end of the 19th century. My father was born in around 1926, and he was the second family of my grandfather, who was Brazilian, Gregorio Bancole Evaristo. So his heritage was Nigerian. I think my grandfather was Nigerian, but he was part of the movement of freed slaves who sailed back to West Africa when slavery ended in Brazil, which didn't end until 1888, so it's very, very late. So my father came to England in 1949, and he came to study. He didn't study. He just got sort of swept up in socializing, and, you know, he became eventually a welder in a factory, and Britain, as I'm sure a lot of you know, in the 1940s, for immigrants from Africa and Asia, was a very, very, very racist place. So he experienced a lot of that frontline racism. And then he met my mother, who was training to be a teacher. I think they met in 1953, and she was a Catholic and a very good convent girl, and she went to a teacher's training college that was run by nuns, and they met at a Commonwealth dance, and they fell in love, and they got married, and my mother's side of the family went hysterical because of the marriage, because it was simply the worst thing that my mother could do. She was an only child. Her mother, my grandmother, had put everything into her. My grandmother came from working class Irish parentage, and, you know, she put all her dreams into my mother so that my mother would, you know, step up a class. You know, and it's completely understandable. To be working class in Britain at the turn of the 20th century was, you know, to suffer and to live a life of hardship. And then my mother goes, you know, she goes to a grammar school, she goes to college, she's supposed to marry something like a doctor, and then she comes home and says she's in love with this very dark-skinned, as it happened, black Nigerian man who is a welder. And so my mother's side of the family went completely hysterical. And that was the big narrative of my childhood, that my grandmother objected to my mother marrying my father. And then the children were born, and my mother didn't just have 1 child, or 2 children, or 3, which would have been quite common back in the 50s and early 60s, but she had 8. One after the other, 8 children in 10 years. Just when everybody else was cutting back. So that was also something my grandmother didn't like. And my grandmother was surprised that the children were lighter than my father, because she didn't understand how race works, how color works. And she fell in love with my eldest sister, who happened to be a very pretty child. And that kind of began to heal the wound between my mother and my grandmother. But my grandmother never really got on with my father. They never really healed that wound. So we grew up as this family. My parents stayed together for 33 years, which was a really long time for that period, because a lot of interracial marriages did not last. But they stayed together for 33 years. My father was very strict and disciplinarian, which I think he had to be with 8 children. And I grew up in a place called Woolwich, which today, if anybody knows it today, it's very much a hip place to live. And when I say to people I come from Woolwich, they're like, oh, you come from Woolwich. But actually, the Woolwich I grew up in is nothing like the Woolwich of today. It was a military town, it was white, working class, and it was very, very white. Now it is incredibly multiracial. So we grew up as this very large black family in a very white area, where we were seen as different, as outsiders, and they used to smash our windows in all the time. We lived in this great big house in our road. I think it was the biggest house in the road, but they did not like us. So there was an alley running down the side of our house, and they were always smashing in the windows. And that kind of says a lot about the kind of climate that I grew up in the 60s and 70s. But, you know, it was all the making of me, because as a writer, everything you go through is material. I wouldn't be the person I am today sitting here if I hadn't have had that childhood, you know? And I went to a girls' grammar school, and I really enjoyed school. I made friends. I never had a problem making friends, you know, even though I was often the only girl of color or the only black girl in wherever I was, you know, whatever space I was in.
So one of the spaces where you really found yourself and found a safe space was, I think, the Young People's Theatre in Greenwich. And your creative journey actually started in the theatre more than in literature. So how did theatre help you in your writing later on and in your journey as a creative person?
Yeah, so from the age of 12, I went to what was called Greenwich Young People's Theatre. It's now called Tramshed. It's still going. I don't think I realized it at the time, but I was probably the first intake of kids there. And I spent the whole of my childhood going to the youth theatre. My father, as I said, was very strict, and he didn't want us playing on the streets, which, of course, children did then in the UK. Children would go out and they would play on the streets. Like my husband, who's a white Englishman, his whole childhood, he would leave home on a Saturday morning and come back in the evening, and he just was allowed to play out. But my father didn't let us do that, and I think he probably had valid reasons for not letting us do that. And he didn't like us going out socializing with our friends either, like going to people's houses or whatever. But he thought the youth theatre was a safe space. And that was where I first encountered creativity. I found a community. When I think about it now, those children were all kind of outsiders in one way or another. One of my best friends, still my best friend, is from that era. She was half Iraqi. And I just felt very, very welcome there. And it was a place where we played, we created theatre, I expanded my imagination, I started to go to theatre from the age of 12, and in a sense had a more middle-class life through being, or at least a sort of having a creative life through being associated with the youth theatre, which was a place where middle-class and working-class kids gathered. It was very egalitarian in that sense. And then I eventually went to drama school, Rose Bruford College of Theatre and Performance, as it's called now, for 3 years. And I studied in what was called a community theatre arts course. And I chose that course because I realized that community theatre was a place where you could find employment as a black person or a person of color. Because when I went to drama school in 1979, it was very hard to get into drama school if you were from anybody. It always is. It's very, very hard to get into drama school. But if you were a person of color, it's extremely hard because they didn't like to take in, and they would say this, they would not train actors of color because there was no work for you. So why would they train you? In the end, I got into 4 schools, which was great after I tried for a few seasons. But this place was a community theatre place, and that's where I became a writer, because community theatre is about creating your own theatre and finding your voice as well as performing. And that's when I started writing. And then after I left drama school, I worked in theatre for many years, and then I started to write books.
You have very clearly, not just in your memoirs, which is Manifesto on Never Giving Up. I'm sure many of you have read this book. And this is what we're going to primarily talk about. I just want to warn you, we're not talking about girl, woman, other today. That's another session, which I will leave to Shondip. He's sitting right in front. I'm not going to encroach into that space. But in Manifest, you say very clearly that you adopted at a very early age a black political identity. That was a conscious choice that you made. And your politics actually stem back into your parents' lives, because even though you said that your father was a welder, he was very much working class, your mother was a teacher, but they also had very active political lives. Your father was the first black councillor of the borough of Greenwich, if I'm not mistaken. So for them, it was actually really sticking their necks out when they could have just, kept quiet and, got on with their family lives, a huge family with 8 children. But they did sort of extend themselves to try and make things better for others. And how did that inform you as a person and your politics today?
It's very interesting because I think when you're a child, you're just in your life. You're not reflecting on it because you're living it and you're growing up in it. And so it wasn't until much later in life that I could see that I'm a very political person. I could see that came from my family background because, as you say, my father, he arrives in 1949 as an immigrant. And by the 60s, sort of late 60s, he becomes a Labour councillor. And a Labour councillor is somebody who represents a constituency. It's not the same as being a member of parliament. It's a local council system that we have in the UK. But you give up your time and you help people with their problems. And you have a little office, which he had on an estate around the corner from where I lived, and he would help people. And they were mainly, because of the area, white working class people who needed help, and he would represent them wherever they needed to be represented. He was in the Labour Party. We used to get the Morning Star, which was the communist paper that used to come in. I think it was once a week. He was the shop steward in the factory where he worked. And then my mother was a Catholic. And I always say my mother was a true Catholic. I mean, first of all, she had 8 kids, right? So that's a very Catholic thing to do. Nobody else was having 8 children. That's because of contraception. If you don't know about Catholics, right, you're not supposed to use contraception. But she was a very good person. And she was the shop steward, so she was the union rep at the school where she taught as well. And they would go on marches, and they would take us on marches, and they were sort of anti-Nazi League marches and anti-racism marches. And we would have political conversations around the table. And that was very much embedded in the fabric of my childhood. But somehow I kind of disassociated from that when I went to drama school and discovered black politics in a very different way, black feminist politics, and then embraced that. But the roots were much deeper, actually. And as a writer, politics underpins my writing, but of course my writing isn't political in the sense that I write stories and those characters have to breathe and be their own people. My books are not a mouthpiece for my politics, because that would be polemic and pedantic and nobody would want to read them. But I've always had this very strong social awareness, which has carried through to my professional life as somebody who also has set up many inclusion projects in the arts over the years.
Yes, I was coming to your feminist politics, so I'm glad you alluded to that. You have said, again, very frankly in your memoirs that you were very angry at one point of time. You were an angry feminist, and it was a very undeveloped, unilateral way of looking at the world. And it's only over the course of years that you've realized that anger is perhaps not as potent as it's made out to be, unless it is also sort of supplemented with action. And having a place at the table and having a voice is much better than standing on the outside and just, walking out of theaters, which you have done in your childhood. Not in your childhood, in your adolescence, of course, and your youth. So how has that understanding developed over the years, and how has your theater work and your first forays into writing? You started off with writing poetry. Poetry was the first medium in which you wrote. So how did that inform your feminism?
Well, you know, when I went to drama school, which was the community theatre arts course, we were taught by very politicized theatre makers who were working in the arts. They were actively directing and writing plays that were being produced and performed. Most of them were women and most of them were feminist. So it was, you know, it was a very fertile place to understand feminism. There were also 5 black women in my year, which was very unusual for drama school at that time. And so we then started to develop a black feminism, because for us, feminism was, as we would say today, intersectional. But that wasn't a term that was around then. But that was our, as we say today, lived experience, right? It wasn't just about being women, it was also about being women of color and how that impacted on how we existed in the world and lived in the world. And so I started to write plays at drama school, and my plays came out as poetry. So I was writing dramatic poems, if you like. And again, for many years, I didn't understand where that came from. But then when I think about it, I grew up in the Catholic Church, which is they use extremely poetic language in the Bible, in the Psalms, and so on. And I went to a convent for the first 4 years of my education.
The performance element in the Catholic Church is something
very ritualistic. And I imbued that every Sunday for at least 10 years of my childhood, the formative years of my childhood. And then I was also acting in Shakespeare at schools and other plays like Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas at school. And of course, I was then absorbing the poetry of this language as well. And so when I started to write for theatre, it came out as poetry. And that's why I understand where it came from now. And then I was writing poetry that was very political in the sense that I don't do now, in that it was very polemic, because I was a young woman in my 20s and I was angry, and I think that's a good stage to go through. These days I call it energy rather than anger, although sometimes I do still feel angry at, you know, I think it's a normal human emotion, especially at things that are happening in the world right now. So I channeled my energy into my creativity and was writing very much from a black women's perspective. And the theatre company that I founded with 2 other black women when I was at drama school was called Theatre of Black Women, which was very much in keeping with the kind of theatre companies that emerged in the late 70s and 80s. And they were all addressing particular demographics that were not being addressed in the mainstream theatre culture. For example, the National Theatre or the regional theatres or the Royal Shakespeare Company. They were not putting on plays by black or Asian writers, and they were not casting black or Asian writers. So the alternative was for us to create our own theatre and to speak about the world as we saw it and lived it and experienced it and imagined it and so on. And so Theatre of Black Women, which at that time, black was a term that also included Asian people, so we also had Asian people in the company, and it was very much a political term. I think that has changed over the decades. So it was a company of women of African and Asian descent, and we produced our own plays, and we toured, and I wrote, and I acted, and that was, and also found, oh yes, please, it's getting hotter and hotter onto here. And I found a wider community of essentially women. Feminism was not really something that was embraced by men in the early 80s or late 80s or even 90s, mid-90s, late 90s, noughties. Hey, should we talk about the 20s? You know, there was a brief period, Me Too, when, you know, I'm an ally. But to be honest, and I don't want to generalize, but it was very much something that was kind of led by men and led by women and supported by women. And so there was this community of women in the UK in the 80s, as I'm sure they were in other communities, where we supported each other in the arts. And some of those people, you know, I've done really well since winning the Booker, but there's also people like Labaina Himid, who's an artist who won the Turner Prize, and various other people who were working with other art forms, like Adjoa Ando, who plays Mrs. Banbury, anyway, in Bridgerton. She was very much part of that community. So we were all young women then who felt like we were outside the mainstream and were determined to be a voice wherever we could be a voice, and that wasn't in the mainstream. So I wasn't the plays that I was writing and performing in and producing were not at the National Theatre. We were touring to community venues and small fringe theatres and finding our audience there. And I wouldn't be a writer today if I hadn't have spent all those years, which was about 6 years, in that community where I was able to develop my interests and my voice and my passions as a writer in a supportive atmosphere, where nobody was telling me to tone it down. Nobody was telling me, well, that, you know, these black characters you're writing are marginal, nobody's interested in them, because we were supporting each other. And then I left that eventually by the end of the 80s and started to write books. And then it continued through my books.
Why did you choose poetry as your first medium of written expression?
I think it chose me, you know, as I said, because I had this background in the church, in the Catholic Church, and with performing in Shakespeare plays and so on. It just came out as poetry. It wasn't a conscious choice. When I started writing, the poetry was already there.
That's beautiful. You know, one of the themes of this year's literary meet is love stories, and its very different shades and hues, including toxic love stories, which is such a big thing nowadays. But you've been incredibly frank and honest about your own love stories in Manifesto. And that probably started with your parents' love story and giving us context to that. But your own relationships from the time that you were a very young woman working in theater to the time that you got married and, you know, found a life partner, that has really informed your work in many ways, because you've spoken about a period of time when you were almost creatively dead because you didn't really feel secure and nurtured in the relationship that you were in. And in some ways, it seeped into your work in both Girl, Woman, Other, of course, and the wonderful book that you wrote before that, Mr. Loverman. I don't know how many of you have read that. I would recommend it highly. It's also been adapted into a mini-series for BBC Two. I don't know how we can see that in India, but the book is available on online platforms and you can buy it. So there's a love story there as well, the heart of it. So how did your own love stories impact the writing of love stories in your novels?
Oh, interesting question. So in my 20s, I had relationships with women. So I had a very separatist period in my life, which I think, you know, I enjoyed myself. It was great. But that also compounded my feeling of being outside of the mainstream. And I had a very, what we would call a toxic relationship with an individual who's 20 years older than me. And, you know, one of the things I talk about in Manifesto is, you know, my life through my creativity and vice versa, and how I talk about relationships in the book. I talk about many things. I talk about my ancestry, I talk about relationships, I talk about the homes I've lived in and the sort of very peripatetic lifestyle that I've had. But the relationships is something that, you know, affects us profoundly. Our day-to-day living experience, who we're living with or who we're involved with. And I had this period where I was involved with women, and 5 years with somebody who was very domineering. And I say that if I'd have stayed with this person, I would have stopped writing because they crushed my creativity. And it got to the point where I had no confidence, where if I met people, strangers, with this person, I wasn't really allowed to speak, you know, because I was supposed to take their lead and to follow them, which also kind of then made me reconsider the kind of feminism that I believed in, because I realized that power is power and people will abuse it, regardless of their gender and regardless of the kind of relationships that they're in. And my view of feminism had been very simplistic up to that point. But I escaped that relationship, but it was 5 years. And then I then had other relationships, and I married my husband nearly 20 years ago now. But one of the things, I do explore relationships with my books. Girl, Woman, Other, you could say it's a book of relationships. But when people talk about my work, and actually when I'm interviewed about my work, so this is a note to my interviewer tomorrow, is that people say, oh, you write about identity. He's not listening, is he? People
Sandeep, a note to you from Bernardine.
I say my book's about relationships. You know, it's one of the prisms you can look through which you can look at my work. Go Woman Other is about multiple relationships. Mr. Loverman, many relationships. Blonde Roots, Soul Taurus, The Emperor's Babe. But people always say, oh yeah, you're writing about identity. And I talk about that in this book because it really annoys me, because are we not all writing about identity? And they will say this before they've even read my work. There is this assumption that if you're a black woman writing, for example, black or black female characters, that somehow it's about identity. And it's a very lazy, reductive way of looking at our writing. Or they will say it's about race. And I'll say, well, actually, one of my books is about race. Just because I have black characters does not mean to say it's about race, or they'll say it's about racism. Well, it's not necessarily about racism. If you look at Mr. Loverman, or if you look at Go Woman Other, racism is, you know, it's woven into some of the stories, but it is not the dominant theme. You know, it's about the humanity of these characters. So these are some of the ways in which I think, as a writer who is black and female, you have to grapple with it's not just what you write, but how the world perceives it or chooses to box you in, which is what I'm constantly fighting against.
You mentioned your sort of peripatetic existence in your youth, and these tumultuous relationships, and then finally finding the stability that you craved in many ways, didn't you? So, but through it all, you still kept producing work, whether it was good, bad. You found a home of your own in writing. And now you are, in fact, mentoring many young writers as a professor of creative writing in Brunel, and in the many initiatives that you have set up for inclusion in the written word. And what would you, if you had a mentor like yourself in your younger days, what advice would you have given the young Bernardine?
Wow, I never studied creative writing, so I just learned through trial and error over many years, right? I would spend years working on a manuscript and throw it away, and I did that several times because I didn't really know what I was doing, and I'm very stubborn. I would persist with the project until, for some reason or other, I recognized that it really wasn't going to work. So it's been a very long and a very hard process for me, writing. And of course, creative writing teaching provides you with all the shortcuts, the feedback and so on, that can be very helpful to you as a young writer. But I'm also a very individualistic writer, and I don't think I would be if I'd have gone through a creative writing course, right? So the advice I give myself is really just to do what you're doing, to learn the hard way, but to understand that things change, that life changes. I am 65 years of age, so I know how life and society has changed during the course of all my years, all my lifetime, and that the culture that enjoys Go Woman Other was not around 10 years before that, or definitely not 20 years before that, and definitely not 40 years before that. So it's about being in the moment, living in the moment, and trusting that everything will work out. One of the things I practiced and discovered in my 30s was don't groan and yawn, but the power of positive thinking, the power of setting unrealistic goals. I went on all these personal development courses, which I also talk about in the memoir, in order to set me on the path of where I wanted to be, to dream big, to have big aspirations, to keep going, even though sometimes things were really tough. And these are things that aren't really passed on to you unless you're living or growing up in an environment where people are going to pass those things on to you. If you're growing up in a very middle-class, successful, perhaps even wealthy, privileged family, it could be that these things are automatically passed on to you by parents who understand this without even having to articulate it. They will pass it on to you. But I didn't grow up in that kind of family. My father was an immigrant welder in a factory. He didn't really know how power worked from the inside. I know how power works from the inside now because of the journey I've been on through my life. And my mother came from a very working class background. She did become a school teacher. She was outside of the sort of power hierarchies in our society. And it's really important that we understand how that works in order to be able to negotiate the space. And I learned the hard way how to do that. And, but I think that was the only way, you know, it was the only way, that was the way I needed to learn. I don't even know if I'd have been a very good student if somebody was mentoring me, because I have to find my own way through the challenges that I face.
One of the things that you've spoken about in Manifesto is to have a positive mental attitude. You say that, PMA. So how do you teach positive mental attitude? I mean, is that something you just let others navigate and find, or do you have a manifesto that you would say that you try this and see if it works for you? What do you tell your students?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I'm setting exercises to my students and I give them half an hour to write an exercise, and then they share it with the group and they read it out aloud, and then sort of natural tendency for a lot of students is to say, oh, it's rubbish. And I will say, but you've just written it. You haven't even reread it yourself. Why are you saying it's rubbish? Because they don't believe in themselves, they're lacking confidence. This is just an exercise. We're experimenting. You know, you shouldn't put too much store into it, and don't demean it before you've even given it a chance to breathe. So that's the way in which I will impart that kind of positivity to them. But I have to say, because I don't think we should go into detail here about positive mental attitude, because it'll take too long. But this is not, when I say positive mental attitude, it's not to be unrealistic. It's not to just see the good in everything. It's not to be aware to all the complications and difficulties and challenges that we're always facing in our lives. It's just to believe that when I write a book, it's gonna be a great work when I finish it, even before I've set pen to paper. That sets me on course to write whatever I write. It's not for me to say whether it's great or not. Other people will or won't. But I don't approach writing a book and say to myself, oh, this is going to be rubbish, it's going to be crap, well, I might as well just get it done. I approach it with a PMA, which is saying, this is great, it's going to be wonderful, before I've even set pen to paper. And that galvanizes me to be the best writer that I can be.
Because there are some problems which are systemic, and you really need to sort of change the system, or at least, like you say, have a seat at the table. And you have done a lot to, you know, make these systemic changes in your own way once you had a seat at the table. So if you can just tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives that you've started in order to make the process of writing and being a creative person more inclusive in England today.
Yeah, I mean, I've set up various projects. I think one of the most successful is a project called The Complete Works, which ran for 10 years and was funded by the Arts Council. And I set it up because I was very aware that poets of colour were not getting published in the UK. There were just a handful. And I went to the Arts Council and said, you need to do some research to find out who is getting published and why they're not getting published. And they did this. They produced the report, which revealed that under 1% of poetry books in the UK were published by poets of colour. I knew there was a problem, but here were the statistics to show us. And so then I went to an organisation called Spread the Word, which is a literature development organisation which I co-founded in 1995. I wasn't then working for it, and it's still going today. And I said to them, let's set up a mentoring scheme whereby we mentor poets of colour to bring them to publication. And that's what we did. 30 poets of colour over 10 years, mentored by 30 of Britain's leading poets. And those poets now have walked off with all the leading prizes in the country, and they continue to do so. So it was a very successful scheme, and they were mentored for a year or two each. And they are then passing on to the next generation and to the next generation. Of course, once you have some people who become figureheads and are doing exceptionally well and winning all the major prizes, that then encourages other writers to come through. And one of the problems prior to that was that there were one or two very famous poets who were performance poets. But their poetry was not, the quality of their poetry was in the performance, not on the page. And so people were emulating them. And so were publishers, actually, and festival producers. They wanted the black people to be performers rather than people producing work of quality and craft on the page. And so this scheme really did revolutionise British poetry, and it went from 1% to 17%, which is a really high percentage. Of course, it changes every year. But these poets are now producing several books each. And so that's one of the schemes.
And I'm glad you mentioned statistics because I was watching, I think, one of your podcasts or interviews where you said that it is important to remember the numbers, to know where the inequality lies. I mean, when we say Toni Morrison was the first black woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, it's not entirely true, is it? Because she's the only black woman to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And you became the first black woman to win the Booker Prize for your 2019 novel Girl, Woman, Other. And before I throw it open to the audience for Q&As, I would just like Bernardine to read 2 short paragraphs from Manifesto, which in her own words really gives a sense of what it meant, the moment that became much more than the individual.
It was a life-changing experience for me to win the Booker Prize, especially with a novel that is such a celebration of black women's lives. The Booker Prize ceremony takes place in the Gothic Great Hall of Guildhall, which was built on the site of a Roman amphitheatre and has been in existence in its present incarnation since 1440. To sit in that hall is to be connected to 2,000 years of British history. The prize judges chose 2 winners for 2019's award, Margaret Atwood for The Testaments, the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, and myself. I'll never forget how elated I felt when my name was called out by the chair of the jury. Margaret and I met at the steps of the stage and hugged. 2 women, 2 races, 2 nations, 2 generations, 2 members of the human race. And then we ascended the stage hand in hand to rapturous applause. It was a landmark historical moment for literature and for the sisterhood.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes, I can see 2 hands in front. We have some roving mics.
Hello, welcome to Kolkata. Just had one question. With the rise of anti-progressive politics throughout the world, especially the last one being Trump, what impact do you think will it have on literature and arts? Will it shut down the progressive voices?
I hope not. But, you know, I say to people in the UK, obviously the people I associate with tend to be progressive, I say you need to read the right-wing media because you need to know how the anti-progressive rhetoric, anti-diversive, political manipulation has been, anti-woke actually, political manipulation, woke, has been ongoing for a number of years. People are being brainwashed, and that's just in the right-wing media. I don't even know about what's out there on social media because I'm not really tapped into most of it. So I think there is an impact. There is definitely an impact. And we know that what happens in America has a trickle effect around the world. And of course, diversity has become a dirty word. And that's been happening for about the last 2 years or so. And we keep changing the vocabulary or the language we use to describe inclusion. You know, it's multiculturalism, it's diversity, it's inclusion. It's progressive, and all of it is being demonized, right? To the extent that people will say they are anti-progressive. Even there's a particular woman writer who declares herself pro-Trump and anti-progressive. She wouldn't have the career that she has if it wasn't for progressive politics, because we're including feminism in that, right? And it's feminism that has given her the career that she has. So I think we're all processing what happened, obviously with Trump being elected, and also what's happening in the UK. And I think the first thing we need to do is to not bury our head in the sand. We need to be alert to what's happening, and then we need to strategize, because I think we're in very dangerous territory, and I don't know where it's going to lead us. And so I think, we need to not be passive about it, but to engage with it actively. But I don't have any direct solutions, but we definitely need to be, alert.
As a researcher at the intersection of colonialism and feminism, it's a larger-than-life opportunity to have an interaction with you. As you said that writings of the women of color do not get published in UK, In this present international scenario of unemployment, how one can pursue a literary career without a government stamp of university lecturer?
Sorry, what was the second half of that question?
In this present scenario of international unemployment, how one can pursue a literary career without a government stamp of university lecturer?
Oh, I see. I mean, I became a professor at university in 2011, and I was a professional writer. You know, I'd been a professional writer for decades before that. There's a lot of writers in the UK are not working in universities. That's something that's come about probably increasingly in the last 15 years or so, although universities are in crisis in the UK at the moment because they're not recruiting in the way that they need to, especially the arts, and there's a long reason for that, to do with various things, but especially to do with the Tory government being in power for as long as they were. So you have to be resourceful, and I actually say to my creative writing students who want to be writers, get a job. You know, get a job that supports you. And that's actually quite a good thing for a writer. I think it can be very limiting to only write. You know, you need to get out there and engage with the world. And one of the ways you can do that is through finding a job that allows you to write in the evenings and at the weekends. And to, if you're really serious, create a life where you can do that. You know, I created a life where I was able to take jobs in arts management that enabled me to write the weekends and in the evenings. And that meant I also didn't have other commitments like children, for example, because I think then I would have had to earn more money, you know, in order to support a child. So you just have to be resourceful. And as I say, I would say most writers in the UK are not teaching in universities. They're earning their living, some of them through writing, but a lot of them through being resourceful.
Shubhankar, can you just ask?
Thank you. That was incredibly inspiring. I wanted to ask, because you've worked in theatre and you advocate for inclusive practices across creative fields, what you think about race-blind and gender-blind casting, which is so big in the UK now, and how those impulses have extended to film, where race, gender, and sexuality have to align perfectly between, you know, actor and character. And do you think sometimes it's taken a bit too far?
I don't know. I think it's a good thing. And it's also, you know, the sort of, you said race and gender, didn't you? It's also age. You know, I saw Glenda Jackson, who was the greatest classical, one of the greatest classical actors of the 20th century. I saw her play King Lear, you know, in a production where all the male parts were played by men. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, for example, a series like Bridgerton, which is not historically correct, but actually, because it is so diverse, it's reached this phenomenal global audience. So I think if a part is very specific, race-specific, sometimes you have to cast according to that, or gender, or age, or whatever. But very often, we've just blown those things out of the water, haven't we? And we are actors, and they're doing what they're trained to do, which to act parts that are not about themselves. And so they're able to inhabit different identities. And I think that's wonderful. I do, and I love to see that. And actually, the BBC is a case in point. But for example, with Mr. Loverman, which is my series now on the BBC, it is very much a Black Caribbean family. And so it doesn't make sense for that to be played by white actors. I mean, there are white actors involved, but they're playing characters who are white. But with a lot of drama, it's about the drama. It's not necessarily about the race of the people. And so it's very fluid, and I like to see it.
Any other questions? Yes, there's one gentleman there and one in front, and I think we'll have to wrap up after that. Oh, okay.
Thank you for your talk. My question is quite simple. You know, before you were a writer, I reckon you were a reader. So who were you reading as a child in your adolescence who kind of helped to forge who you are today as a writer?
You know, we didn't have books because we couldn't afford books in my house. So I went to the library every Saturday and I would take out 2 or 3 books and then take them back. And most of those books I don't remember because they just came and went, right? But I think the writer who really inspired me as a teenager was Tennyson. And also I mentioned Dylan Thomas. And then a bit later it was James Baldwin. And also a writer called Buchi Amacheta. And then by the time I hit my late teens, early 20s, I was reading Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, a writer called Michelle Cliff, Gloria Naylor, all the mainly African-American women writers who were the only writers in the world putting black women at the center of their stories. And I say that literally, the only writers. There were one or two African writers, but not many. But the African-American writers were doing that, and so I was drawn to them. And they were also powerful advocates for black women's feminism or womanism, which is what how Alice Walker described herself. And they had a degree of success, huge success actually, over the period of the 80s. And so they were very, very inspiring for me. So if I were to say who are the writers who made me today, I would say it was a particular cohort of African-American women writers who were at least a generation older than me, and Audre Lorde as well, at least a generation older than me.
One last question, please. The gentleman at the back there, yes.
Hi, ma'am. It's been lovely to hear you speak. A lot of life today is lived very digitally. Kids are going to school, not using pen and paper as much as a few years ago. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is getting in the way of a lot of media distribution. We've got some interesting Bollywood movies which say that writing is only a part of getting what you want. On the whole, are you pessimistic or optimistic about the place of writing and poetry when it comes to causes that you champion and have been championing?
You know, oh God, that's such a big question. That's a panel on its own, really, isn't it? Because I'm very worried, very, very worried. In the UK, statistically, younger children are reading less and less than, you know, I can't remember what the stats are because I can never remember figures really, but they're reading less and less, and that's a very worrying sign. And we know how much young people's lives are being completely eaten up by being online in various ways. There's still a strong reading population, but I think the reading population is the older population as opposed to the younger population. And I think there is evidence to back that up. And so I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic, but I also think that there has to be so much governmental and other forms of intervention to keep young people's brains alive and developing as we know they need to develop, and also the communication to be in person with each other. And there is just so many social issues that we can track back to the sort of addiction to online communication and consumption. And it's a really big challenge ahead of us, I think, and it's happened very quickly. And then you have AI, you know, writing novels, and they're available on Amazon, and, you know, it's scary. So, yeah.
We're trying in our own little way with the Junior Kolkata Literary Meet, where we get authors of children's literature and inspiring figures. And thank you, Bernardine. Thank you so much for sharing so much, not only of your writing, but of your life that has informed your writing. We're very lucky to have you and have your works. And all the best for what you write next. And I think we will move on to the next session now. But Bernardine will be available to do signings at the bookshop. We have her books. So you can go ahead, and I'm sorry if anyone didn't get a chance to ask questions. So perhaps when you get your book signed, you can do that. Thank you. Thank you.